All right, so are you ready to dive into a really fascinating period in Japanese history? We're talking about the Heisei Era.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. We're talking about January 8, 1989 to April 30th, 2019.
Okay, so a solid 30 years?
Yeah, 30 years that saw Japan go through some massive changes. I mean, we're talking economic bubbles bursting, devastating
Oh,
earthquakes.
and don't forget the rise of what people call cool Japan.
Exactly. And we've got a super detailed article here that we're going to be using to really understand this era.
So much to unpack.
Right. Our mission today is to figure out what made this era so important for, how Japan looks today.
Well, it's really interesting, just the name Heisei itself actually translates to achievement of peace.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
And it all kicked off with Emperor Akihito taking the throne.
Yeah.
And after the Showa era, it really felt like, they were trying to send a message.
Okay. Yeah. I can see how that would be a big deal. But before we get too deep into the Heisei era, can you remind me what was going on in the Showa period that would make this emphasis on peace so important?
Yeah, sure. So the Showa era, under Emperor Hirohito, was marked by some, well, pretty intense events.
Right, World War II.
Exactly. World War II being, probably the most significant one. So going from that to achievement of peace, it's definitely like a conscious decision, I think, to signal this new start for Japan. One focused on, recovery and working together with other countries.
Okay, so a clean slate, new goals. Gotcha. But if I'm remembering my Japanese history correctly, the Heisei era didn't exactly start out all peaceful and prosperous, did it?
No, not really. You see, Japan went into the Heisei era as like this economic powerhouse.
They were killing it, right?
Yeah, totally. But then in the early 90s, that infamous bubble burst.
Oh, right, the bubble.
We're talking about this period of super fast growth, but it was all fueled by speculation.
So not built on solid ground.
Exactly. It just wasn't sustainable. And what came after is what a lot of people call the lost decade. Basically a decade of, well, economic stagnation.
A lost decade. That sounds rough. For someone like me who, didn't actually live through it, can you paint me a picture? What did that actually look like? What made it so lost?
Imagine this. A whole society that had gotten used to constant economic progress suddenly having to deal with widespread unemployment.
Yikes.
Job insecurity everywhere, and just a complete loss of confidence in, the systems that people thought were rock solid.
Right.
The lost decade wasn't just about, economic figures. It was this collective feeling of disillusionment, like a huge question mark hanging over the future.
Oh, I bet that really messed things up. And on top of all that economic turmoil, the Heisei era was also hit by some really bad natural disasters, right? Like the Kobe earthquake back in 1995.
Oh, yeah. The Kobe earthquake was devastating. Magnitude 7.3 on the Richter scale.
Yeah.
It caused massive damage and tragically took the lives of over 6,400 people.
It's awful.
One of the things that really stand out in the reports from back then is how vulnerable certain types of infrastructure turned out to be.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, see, a lot of the urban highways in Kobe were built on these elevated structures. And when the earthquake hit, many of them just collapsed, crushing cars and people below.
Oh my gosh, I hadn't even thought about that.
It was a stark reminder of how dangerous those types of construction can be,
Yeah.
especially in areas prone to earthquakes.
It's a horrifying thing to imagine. And then, just 16 years later, you have the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, which of course also triggered the Fukushima nuclear meltdown.
Yeah, 2011, that was rough. The Tohoku earthquake was even stronger than Kobe, magnitude 9.0.
Wow.
And the tsunami that came after was just devastating, causing incredible damage along the entire coastline. The damage to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant led to, well, as you said, a nuclear meltdown, with almost 15,000 deaths and thousands of people still missing. It's considered the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan.
Those numbers are just... I can't even imagine how back-to-back disasters like that would affect, the national psyche. It feels like it would really challenge people's sense of security, maybe even their faith in technology.
You're absolutely right. These disasters had a really deep and lasting impact on Japanese society. On a practical level, they led to big changes in disaster preparedness, building codes being updated, and a huge shift in energy policy.
Makes sense.
But it goes even deeper than that. There was this profound psychological impact, too. People were suddenly grappling with questions of safety and security, the unpredictability of nature, and the potential consequences of, all these technological advancements.
It really makes you think about, like, how do people even begin to process events of that magnitude? And it's not like natural disasters were the only thing they had to deal with, right? There was also the Shinrikyo sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway in 1995.
Yeah, that was a tough one.
I mean, that must have been a huge blow to Japan's sense of safety and, like, social harmony.
It really was. It was a truly shocking event. 12 people died, and thousands more were injured by the sarin gas that members of the Shinrikyo cult released. For a country that, really prided itself on its low crime rates and social cohesion, this attack was a huge wake-up call.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It shattered this illusion of absolute security,
Huh.
really exposed that even homegrown extremism could happen there.
Wow. It's hard to even imagine the collective trauma from an event like that. Did this attack, along with some of these other incidents mentioned in the article, like the attacks in Akihabara in 2008 and Sagamihara in 2016, change the way people interact with each other or like how they view their society?
I think it definitely had a lasting impact on Japanese culture. I mean, obviously you see increased security measures in public spaces. But beyond that, there was this subtle shift in social attitudes. People became much more aware of their vulnerability, more cautious. That assumption of harmony that we were talking about earlier, that was questioned. And there was this renewed focus on each person taking responsibility for their own safety.
Right.
It's like the whole society went through this process of reevaluating what it meant to feel safe and I guess what it meant to live in a world where those kinds of events could happen.
Makes sense. A lot to process there. And then on top of everything else, the Heisei era saw a lot of political changes too, right? The article says there were 17 prime ministers during those 30 years.
17, that's right.
Crazy.
And what's even more significant is that the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, the party that had been in power for so long, they actually lost power for a bit.
Oh, wow.
They've been in control pretty much continuously since 1955.
That's a long time.
So yeah, this was a major shift in the political landscape.
Wow, that's wild. From decades of basically one-party rule to this sudden instability. What do you think was driving those changes? Do you think it was connected to the economic and social stuff we've been talking about?
Oh, absolutely. The economic stagnation of that lost decade, it played a huge role. You see, it eroded public trust in the LDP. They were the ones in charge during the boom years, but then seemed, unable to fix things when everything went south. People started looking for other options, new leaders who could actually do something about this growing sense of unease and uncertainty.
It's almost like all these different things are like threads, the economic struggles, the disasters, the social anxieties. It's like they all got woven together to create this environment that was just primed for political change. And yet, amidst all of this turmoil, something else pops up. Cool Japan. But before we dive into that, can you explain to me what that term actually means?
Sure. Cool Japan is basically this global recognition and popularity of Japanese pop culture.
Yeah.
We're talking anime, manga, video games, fashion, music.
Right.
It's all about how these unique aesthetics, storytelling, and technological innovation from Japan captivated audiences worldwide. It really became a major force in shaping global trends.
So even as Japan was dealing with all these internal problems, they were also blowing up globally with their creativity.
Exactly.
That's amazing. What would you say are some of the biggest examples from the Heisei era that made a global impact? Stuff that even I, someone who was just starting to learn about all of this, might recognize.
Oh, there are so many.
Yeah.
In anime, you've got iconic Studio Ghibli films like Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away.
Oh, I've heard of Spirited Away.
They won tons of awards and were huge all over the world. Then you've got gaming. Pokemon, Super Mario 64.
Yeah.
They basically redefined their genres.
Yeah, for sure.
And let's not forget about Hello Kitty,
Oh, yeah. Hello, Kitty.
the poster child for kawaii culture. That took the world by storm.
Hold on. Back up a sec. Kawaii culture. I feel like I've heard that term before, but remind me, what does it actually mean?
So kawaii basically translates to cute or adorable in English.
Okay.
But it goes deeper than just like an aesthetic. In Japan, it's this cultural phenomenon that embraces cuteness in every way possible. Fashion, character design, everyday objects, even behavior.
Wow.
Hello Kitty is kind of the perfect example of kawaii culture. The simple design, those big eyes, it all just screams adorable, and it appeals to people of all ages.
That's so interesting. It's like cuteness is this whole cultural concept, and it's pretty wild to think that this rise of cool Japan was happening at the same time as all these other changes we've been talking about.
It really makes you think. On the one hand, you have Japan struggling with economic woes, social anxieties, and the aftermath of these devastating disasters. But on the other hand, you've got this creative energy just exploding outward, captivating people all over the world.
Like two sides of the same coin.
It's almost like a testament to how resilient the human spirit can be and the power of, creative expression, how it can rise above even the toughest situations.
It's a really complex and interesting time period, even just from what we've talked about so far. What I'm curious about now is how did all this impact Japan's relationship with technology? It seems like the Heisei Era was this period of both huge advancements and like anxieties about those advancements.
Yeah, definitely. You see the Shinkansen, the bullet train
Yeah.
network expanding rapidly. You've got these iconic structures like the Tokyo Skytree being built.
Right.
But then there's the shadow of Fukushima, a really stark reminder of the potential downsides of technology. I think it's fair to say that the Heisei era saw Japan pushing the boundaries of what's possible, but also facing some pretty serious consequences.
A bit of a double-edged sword, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Okay, before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, one last thing. The article mentions that Emperor Akihito abdicated in 2019, which marked the end of the Heisei era. That was a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a historic event, the first time a Japanese emperor had abdicated in over 200 years. It really felt like a symbolic closing of a chapter, like an acknowledgement that a new era was needed to face the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century.
So a sense of closure, but also a hint of what was to come.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really did feel like the end of an era,
Yeah.
Akihito stepping down. It was a powerful moment, especially given everything that Japan had gone through during the Heisei era. It makes you wonder how those experiences, shaped the national character.
It's true. It's like that idea we were talking about earlier, Japan is this, dynamic society constantly evolving. And one of the things the article touches on is the rise of hikikomori, those individuals who withdraw from society. You explained what that term means, but can we dig a little deeper? What do we actually know about what causes this phenomenon?
Hikikomori. It's complex. There are no easy answers, unfortunately. It often affects young adults who isolate themselves in their homes for long periods of time, sometimes even years. And while it's often associated with Japan, you actually see similar trends of social isolation and withdrawal in other parts of the world, too.
Oh, interesting.
So it's not just a Japanese thing, There are probably these broader social, economic, and even technological factors that contribute to it.
That makes sense. Do you think some of the things we've been discussing, like the economic uncertainty of the lost decade or the anxieties from those disasters and attacks, could have made this trend worse in Japan?
I think so, yeah. Imagine being a young person coming of age during that time.
Yeah.
You're looking at this bleak economic outlook. The job market feels totally unstable. And the world just seems, unpredictable and kind of dangerous. It's understandable that some people would just feel overwhelmed and retreat from all that pressure.
Yeah, I can see that. It's really sad to think about all those young people feeling so lost and alone. But shifting gears a bit, I'm curious about how this period of huge change and modernization impacted how Japan views its own history. Did all this, forward momentum lead to any re-examination of the past, specifically World War II?
That's a great question. On one hand, there was this strong desire to move past the war, to create a new image for Japan, as a peaceful and technologically advanced nation.
Right.
But at the same time, this also sparked debates about how Japan should remember and, I guess, come to terms with its past.
So it wasn't just about forgetting, but about, finding a new way to understand and live with history.
Exactly. There were a lot of efforts to promote reconciliation with neighboring countries that had suffered during the war, acknowledge Japan's role in the conflict, and to, teach younger generations about how complex that period really was. And it's still an ongoing process today. There are constant discussions about, war responsibility, apologies, and the need for accurate history in textbooks and public discourse.
It sounds like a tricky balancing act, acknowledging the past but also looking towards the future. And it strikes me that the Heisei era was full of those kinds of balancing acts. We talked about the tension between technological advancements and the anxieties that come with them. But there are other examples, right?
Oh, tons. The Heisei era was all about this push and pull between tradition and modernity, economic growth and social well-being, individual dreams, and collective responsibility. It was like Japan was walking a tightrope, trying to find its footing as the world was changing so rapidly around it.
And did they find it? Did Japan manage to achieve any sort of balance during this time?
Well, the search for balance, it's an ongoing thing. And the Heisei era was definitely a time of, trying things out and making adjustments. There were definitely moments of progress, but also like setbacks and unintended consequences. But the important thing is that these issues were talked about, debated, and dealt with, even if it wasn't perfect.
So it's like they were laying the groundwork for what would become the main challenges and opportunities of the Reiwa era, which is where we are now.
Yeah, exactly. The Heisei era was this period of intense change and a lot of upheaval. But it also showed how resilient Japan can be,
Yeah.
their willingness to adapt, and I think a growing understanding of the need for balance. And these are qualities that will definitely help Japan deal with all the complexities of the 21st century.
For sure. Okay, let's try to break all this down for someone who's, just starting to learn about Japan. What would you say are a few key takeaways from the Heisei era? What makes it so important to understanding contemporary Japan?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Heisei era really challenges that stereotype of Japan as this unchanging, monolithic entity. It shows that Japan is dynamic, capable of huge changes and adaptation.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
And it's also a reminder that even though they've achieved so much technologically and culturally, they also face a lot of complex issues, like economic disparities, social anxieties, and the impact of globalization.
It reminds you that there's so much more going on beneath the surface of what we might perceive as, a homogenous culture.
Exactly. And I think that's why studying this period is so fascinating. It reveals all these different sides of Japan, the innovation, the introspection, the struggles, the triumphs. It's all there.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Economic bubbles, natural disasters, cool Japan, anxieties about technology. And then with Emperor Akihito stepping down, that chapter closes. But I have to ask, what kind of legacy did the Heisei era leave behind?
That's a huge question. And I think it's one that people will probably be debating for a long time. But I think one of the most lasting impacts of the Heisei era is that it brought this awareness of how interconnected we all are, how global issues really affect everyone.
Okay.
The economic downturn, those environmental disasters, the rise of global pop culture. These were all events that went beyond national borders, forcing Japan to engage with the world in these new, complex ways.
It's like Japan went through this period of, deep self-reflection, dealing with its own internal issues, but also recognizing its place in a globalized world. And what came out of that was this deeper understanding of its own identity and how it fits into the bigger picture.
I think that's a great way to put it. And that new perspective, along with all the lessons they learned from both the good and the bad of the Heisei era, I think it will definitely shape how Japan moves forward in the years to come.
It really shows how much history shapes the present, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of the present, we're now in the Reiwa era, which started on May 1st, 2019, with Emperor Naruhito taking the throne. It really does feel like a whole new chapter for Japan.
hmm
But how do you see the Heisei era influencing this new period? Is it more of a clean break, or are we still seeing some of those same themes and challenges?
I don't think it's a clean break at all. You don't just erase 30 years of history overnight. The Reiwa era is inheriting a Japan that's been deeply shaped by all those things that happened during the Heisei era. Like we were talking about the economic landscape, social values changing, how the country sees itself on the world stage. It all plays a role.
So, what are some specific ways you think those Heisei events might be impacting the Reiwa era? Are those anxieties about the economy from the lost decade still a thing? Oh, for sure. Japan is still dealing with a lot of the issues that came up during that time. Things like deflation, and aging population, and fewer people in the workforce. These are tough problems to solve, and they're still a big part of policy debates. They influence how people think about the future.
It's like that feeling of uncertainty that we talked about earlier. It's just like lingering in the background.
Yeah, but I think there's also this sense of opportunity too. I mean, the Heisei era, for all its problems, also showed how resilient Japan is, how they can adapt and change. Remember how they dealt with those disasters? How they reinvented themselves culturally with cool Japan?
Yeah, that was amazing.
Those experiences, they kind of gave Japan this resourcefulness, this willingness to try new things.
I see what you mean. It's not just about the bad stuff that happened. It's about how they learned to deal with it. And what about cool Japan? I mean, that didn't just disappear when the era changed. Right.
Nope, not at all. You could even argue that cool Japan's even bigger now. Japanese pop culture is still a huge global force. I mean, look at anime, manga, video games, J-pop, fashion. It's all still thriving, still changing and evolving in the Reiwa era.
It's amazing to think about, this creative energy that came out of such a turbulent time. It turned into a source of national pride and global recognition.
It really shows how powerful art and culture can be. They transcend borders and connect people. It's like a reminder that even when you're dealing with economic struggles and all those anxieties, there's still this vibrancy, a creative spirit that just can't be put down.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the Heisei era, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We talked about the rise of hikikomori, those individuals who withdraw from society. What do you think? Is this a uniquely Japanese phenomenon, or is it more like a reflection of what's happening globally, maybe just amplified by what was happening in Japan?
That's a really good question. And
Mhm.
honestly, I think it's something that requires a lot of thought. While the term hikikomori originated in Japan, we're seeing this problem of social withdrawal and isolation in other parts of the world too, especially among young people.
It's a trend.
Yeah, it's not just about cultural differences. There are bigger social, economic, and technological forces at play here that are making this happen everywhere.
So it's like Japan, with their unique cultural context and all those challenges they faced during the Heisei era, is maybe experiencing a more extreme version of this global phenomenon. Like they're showing us what can happen when certain pressures and anxieties just get to be too much.
That's a really sharp observation. I think it suggests that we need to look beyond cultural boundaries and start thinking about the bigger picture. Like, what can we learn from what happened in Japan? Are there warning signs we should be paying attention to in our own societies? These are important questions.
It's definitely something to think about. It's a reminder that we're all connected in a lot of ways, that the challenges one country faces often reflect what's happening globally. And maybe by understanding Japan's experience with all its unique complexities, we can figure out how to address these issues on a bigger scale.
I think that's exactly right. The Heisei era, with all its ups and downs, it offers a lot of insight into the human experience. It helps us make sense of the world today and helps us figure out how to handle the challenges and the opportunities in front of us.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Heisei era. Hopefully you've gained some insight into what shaped Japan into the country it is today.
Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world around you. See you next time.